I said, well, for heaven's sake, put your tie up, tuck your shirt in. So I had to kind of smarten him up a bit. And then I remember when he was Prime Minister, and this is when I was controller, I was like lurking behind the Speaker's chair because the job was to get the Prime Minister in good time for PMQs. And of course, he comes racing down the corridor as always Boris can. Again, hair all over the place, tie over here, collar up. So next minute, I'm kind of doing his tie up and putting his collar down. And then off he goes into the front bed and realised, oh, I've just touched up the PM. So.
This is the exit interview of Conservative MP for Finchley and Golders Green, Mike Freer. MP there since the 2010 general election, but now he's one of, well, more than 100 MPs standing down at the next election. So first question then, Mike, why are you leaving us?
Broadly for me, it's about personal security and having, over the years, had numerous run-ins with various groups who threatened my life. That's alongside the routine abuse and every MP gets. We kind of take that on the chin. But a couple of run-ins with people who wanted to come and stab me. Then Ali Habibi Ali, who went on to kill David Amess, came to Finchley first, and luckily by the skin of my teeth I wasn't there that day. And he said he came to Finchley to harm me. And that could have been fatal. And then the arson attack at Christmas, although that turns out to have been just a local scrote, as I say, who came to decided to have fun and set fire to the back of the office. My husband and family said, I don't really care what the motivation is. If you're dead, you're dead. And so just the whole kind of having to worry about my family worrying, it's kind of, it's not really enough to carry on, and I should go off and do something else.
It's interesting because we've been doing this series for months now, speaking to, I think it's 20 MPs so far, different parties. And when I ask that question normally, why are you leaving us? They say, well, I feel I've done my bit, or I've been here for so many years, or I want to do something else. There's a bit in the background possibly about they've got a very small majority. And then during the course of the conversation, actually, the abuse, the threats start sort of bubbling up in the conversation, and it actually seems to be playing on the minds of people more. You seem to be unusual in being so explicit about it, rather than being unusual that you've been targeted.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with the low-level stuff. I mean, as well as the kind of the big incidents with Muslims Against Crusade, who targeted me twice, Ali Habibi Ali, and the art attack. They're the kind of the big incidents. But alongside that, you come out of your house and you find a note on your car, and people know where I live, but not necessarily the car I drive, and that's always a bit of a worry. I was followed around Brent Cross once by someone shouting, you're useless, you're useless, you're useless. In itself, not necessarily a physical threat, but still, you should be able to go out and do your daily life without feeling that you're going to get abused. And that kind of stuff just eventually just grinds you down. And then after the Ali Habibi Ali incident, my office, my house became a fortress, panic buttons everywhere on public events where people knew where I'd be. So if I was doing what's called a supermarket surgery, literally where you stand by the front door of the supermarket and talk to your constituents, or the over 55s advice fair that I do twice a year, wearing a stab vest. And I remember very much my husband Angelo being very, very unhappy seeing me going to work in a stab vest. So that is a bit more, if you like, in your face than perhaps other colleagues have had to have. But sadly, it does grind you down. It's a job I do enjoy. Like every job, you have bad days. The inbox some days can be pretty fruity, shall we say. And other days you actually cut through and you can change things for people. So it's an amazing job, and I'm sad to be leaving. But I do have to, no MP can do this job without a supportive family. And if you're going home to a husband, a spouse who is worried about you, or you're leaving home to go to work knowing that they're worried about whether you're going to come home or not, then you have to think it's not really worth it anymore.
Do you think you get it worse than some? And do you have any sense of why that might be?
I certainly seem to have had more run-ins with violence than most. And certainly the run-ins against Muslims against Crusades was clearly driven by my support for Israel and the Jewish community. Ali Habibi Ali's motive was a bit unknown. I mean, he described himself as a soldier of Islam. Um, that's about as close as a motive as we can get, because someone like David Amos and I, we were very different wings of the party. We had very similar views on Iran, we had very similar views on Israel and the Middle East, but beyond that, we didn't really have a lot of commonality. So that seems to be the only common trait. Obviously, some of the abuse tends to be a little bit anti-Semitic. Bizarrely, I'm not Jewish, but because I represent the seat with the largest Jewish community, people assume I'm Jewish. So sometimes you do get that level of abuse as well. But to be fair, a lot of MPs get abuse, and I have to say my female colleagues get it worse. So I've had perhaps more violent attacks, but the threats of violence tend to be much more directed at female MPs. What I found, Matt, was quite striking is after I made my announcement, which wasn't quite designed to kind of light up the media the way it did, 4 Labour MPs and 1 Conservative MP spoke to me privately and said that the 4 Labour MPs said they'd had someone in prison for death threats against them. And my Conservative colleague had someone who gone to prison for stalking. And I'm going, why didn't I know that? And I went to see the Speaker and I said, look, you know what's going on, because even the low-level stuff gets reported to the Parliamentary Security Team. We need to publish in full what's going on so people can see the scale of it. Robust debate is one thing. It's, our accessibility is a very special part of our democracy. But there comes a point where we have to kind of rebalance the debate about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But at the moment, people don't know the scale of the problem.
Is there a broader societal problem? And I wonder about whether actually the tenor of our politics over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years have played a part in this as well, about the way politicians treat each other, the way politicians use the media to attack each other, the way the media treat politicians. I'm not trying to draw a line between, the rhetoric, outspoken rhetoric from politicians to then someone, seeking to attack. But is there a connection? Do we need to try to push the reset button on that?
I think there's a couple of things there, Matt, to unpick. I think if you go back and look at, you look at the interviews between Mrs. Thatcher and Robin Day or Brian Wald. I'm showing my age now, but I kind of was a bit of a political junkie as a teenager. They weren't deferential. Well, they were kind of respectful, but not deferential. So, she really got grilled, but it wasn't aggressive, talking over, interrupting, trying to make the politician out to be kind of some form of duplicitous crook. And I think that's the kind of bit that's changed. There is an erosion of trust in our politicians. And to be fair, I think there's an element of the way the media interview has changed. Interestingly, without naming the outlet, when I made my announcement, as you know, the media went absolutely wild. I was being asked for interviews right, left and centre. And there was one media outlet who just wouldn't leave me alone. I said, look, I simply can't do it today. I'm absolutely back to back. I do have a day job as well. And said, well, you don't really want us to chase you down the street with cameras, do you? And I felt like saying, so you want to do a story about intimidating MPs by intimidating an MP?
Wow.
That's a nice little story. But anyway, that was an interesting little angle. But I think more broadly what's changed is God, I'm really sounding like an old fart now. The old days, if you wanted to write, the people who used to write in green ink, as they say, it was a bit of an effort to write an abusive letter to your member of parliament. Now you can tweet instantly. Now you can send an email instantly. And that lack of, if you like, personal engagement, you're anonymous. Either the sender's anonymous or certainly because you're communicating electronically, it's not quite as personal. So I think we've dehumanized, in some ways, politics. And also I think social media doesn't take the issue seriously. I mean, I've said several times, I've made complaints and nothing happens. And certainly I remember raising with Facebook, as it was, level of anti-Semitism on Facebook posts, and the number of complaints that simply weren't being handled. And the answer I got back was, they look at the complaints globally. So if you've got, 1 billion complaints across the globe and you've got 100,000 complaints in the UK, it's minuscule, and therefore it's not really seen as a big issue. But for instance, on the 7/10 massacres in Israel, I went to see the footage. I don't particularly want to see it ever again, but that footage is available online, and that desensitizes people as to what's the norm. And then the other thing, I think, where social media, there's a debate to be had, is if you're kind of under 35, you get most of your news for social media now. And therefore, if it's on TikTok, it must be true. If it's on Twitter, it must be true. And kind of that, fact checking, cross checking your facts, reading around the subject to find out what is the truth, that kind of, I think, has fallen away. So things have changed. I think we can reset the dial, but it's going to be an uphill battle.
Let's move away from that, because clearly you don't want. You've been in politics in Parliament since 2010. We don't just want to talk about the man if you're leaving. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher. She was the MP in your seat. So what's it like being a Conservative MP in the seat where, possibly, with the exception of possibly Churchill, she still towers over and influences, probably gets quoted by someone in politics on an almost daily basis. What's that like, following in those famous footsteps?
Well, I think, to be fair, if you speak to the MP that follows any former Prime Minister, it's always the former Prime Minister's seat. But, I mean, obviously, Mrs. Thatcher, as you say, was kind of an iconic figure. Whether people liked her politics, she's remembered for a variety of reasons. And of course, in Finchley, she's remembered not just as the Prime Minister, but she was an amazing constituency MP. And I saw a different side of her. And obviously, like everybody else, you shout at the TV when she came on and think, what the hell's going on now? But usually she was proved right. But I still knock on doors and find people who say, Mrs. Thatcher was on our doorstep, decades ago. And it was quite bizarre that there's this towering figure of history, amazing Prime Minister, who would go door knocking like any other. In some ways, Theresa May is a very similar mould. The anchor was the constituency, and she always said the constituency was where she found out the truth. And we always tell a slight joke that when she used to be Prime Minister, she'd hold her surgery still in Finchley. So every few weeks she'd be in Finchley doing her surgery, and Mrs. Bloggins were there talking about the dripping tap or the broken paving stones. And then she'd jump in the car going back to Downing Street. And as soon as she left, obviously we knew the police would phone ahead to number 10 saying she's on her way back. We get a phone call apparently from number 10 saying, what the hell have you told her this week? Because they knew that as soon as she walked in the door, she'd be firing off questions, wanting to know what's going on. And so the constituency was very much her bedrock. And interestingly, it is true. I see every email, and some MPs have them filtered. I've got an amazing team who triage them and deal with the donkey work, if you like. But I still see every email. And because, you have clicktivism, you suddenly get 50 emails all identically worded. But if you suddenly get 5 or 6 emails about a problem in, Highfield Avenue, you think, that's interesting, what's going on there? And at the weekend, you let a little drive around and find out what's going on. So the constituency, the inbox isn't always representative, clearly. But sometimes you'll spot something in the inbox and think, that's odd, what's going on there? And that allows you to keep in touch with really what's going on in the constituency. It's an amazing constituency, so diverse as well.
It's really interesting that, though, because obviously we were just talking about the negative sides of technology, but actually the fact that people now feel they can just drop you an email and how that starts to build a picture of what's going on in your constituency, clearly plays a big part of your day as well. So we should talk about your job. So you're coming in 2010, clearly a huge, big election, change in the political landscape. Conservatives formed a coalition of the Lib Dems. Since then, you've been a whip, you've been an exports minister, you're now at the Ministry of Justice. Which bit of your time in Parliament have you enjoyed the most? Backbench, whip's office, junior minister? What do you think?
That's a really tough question. I have to say I loved being a whip. It is they are the unsung heroes, and it is the probably the only team in Parliament, because when you're in a department as a portfolio minister, as I call them, you're working as a team, but you're all busy in your own little silo, beavering away doing your bits. When you're in the whip's office, apart from the chief whip, the rest of us are all in one room, shoulder to shoulder. And that's where you see the best and the worst of our colleagues. That's where, there's many stories, but of course, the oath of whip silence still rules. But also, you really find out how Parliament works in the whip's office, really how it all works on behind the scenes. And when I was old-fashioned title controller of Her Majesty's household, that's really, you kind of lurk behind the Speaker's chair, kind of helping the Speaker manage the flow of business. That's fascinating.
Is that also the one when you get taken hostage in Buckingham Palace?
No, that's the Vice Chamberlain.
Oh, okay.
That's the Vice Chamberlain. So that's the one who writes. So that's bizarre, actually, because that's the role who writes to the sovereign every day. And certainly, I don't know, because I wasn't in the whip's office when the King took over, but I did meet the Queen. I had an audience with the Queen when I was appointed. So you have to go in and get your wand of office, and it's great old traditions, and it's all run like clockwork. And every day you'd see the Vice Chamberlain writing these letters, and she didn't want Hansard, she wanted the gossip, because she can read Hansard for herself. So anyway, you go in and you do the handover of the wand, and that's all the kind of formality. And then there's this kind of few minutes of informal chit chat. And they say, now, so tell me about so and so. I gather she's a bit of a handful. What's she up to? And you think, my God, she does read these letters, and she does want to know the colour of what's going on in Parliament. And that was quite an amazing experience, being technically part of the royal household. But then, I look at the job, in terms of exports. My background is sales, so being the chief salesman for UK PLC was great fun. Having to go and bang the drum. I used to joke that Boris had turned me into a Brexiteer, because I used to come back from overseas markets saying, you're right, they want to buy British. One of the biggest barriers to exports is getting British companies out there doing it. So we need to do more to get them on a plane out into overseas markets. And then on qualities, I've worked on diversity, multi-faith all of my public life, long before I became an MP. And now in justice, where I'm not a lawyer, and that does allow you to ask the daft questions. And you say, so why do you do that? And it's like, well, we've had it since about 1648. So it's like, and so it's great fun, because I kind of, not being a lawyer, you are able to kind of unpick things and say, well, do we really need to do that now? Just because it's been done since 1648 doesn't mean we need to keep doing it unless it's actually working. So that's been fascinating. So probably controller, because of kind of the getting to meet the Queen, that, and being in the whip's office, probably edges ahead. But all of the ministerial roles have got high spots of their own.
You talked about the equalities brief. You played, I think people would say, other people have said, when you won awards for it, a significant role when the gay marriage bill was going through Parliament. And having been elected in 2010, you came out then in 2013 when that debate was going on, and you made the point that there were these debates going on, and people didn't know that they were sitting next to a gay MP having these debates. I suppose the first question, looking back now, why did you feel you weren't able to be out trying to get elected in 2010? No, before.
The media got that wrong. So I wasn't in, if you like. I wasn't in the closet. I was out. But certainly when I became leader of Barnet Council, the front page on the Hendon Times was Barnet's first gay leader. So it's hardly a secret.
Okay.
But when I got elected, I didn't want to be the gay MP. I wanted to be a good MP who happened to be gay. So, straight MPs don't go wandering around the tea room saying, hello, I'm so-and-so and I'm straight. So my view is I just happen to, go home to a man. And I want to almost like downplay that side, because it shouldn't really be that relevant. So it was bizarre that I was sitting alongside people who didn't necessarily know I was gay, and why should they? And listening to these bizarre conversations about how it's going to undermine civilization and to bring down the downfall of the government, etc. And you're kind of, hello, maybe that's not quite so true. And so it's quite interesting having some of the discussions with colleagues as well. And I think on the whole, the debate was quite respectful. There are one or two colleagues who are particularly foul, and you kind of expect that. But what's been really pleasing is how many colleagues who opposed equal marriage have now stood up and said they got it wrong. And that's been really, really pleasing because, of course, the world hasn't stopped spinning.
It actually was nice. It was only a few weeks ago that was the anniversary of the first weddings taking place. Yeah. And there were some good documentaries and, written pieces as well, sort of actually looking back with the benefit of 10 years to be able to say sometimes politics is quite good. Some people stick their necks out, they do something in the face of opposition. And like you said, 10 years on, the world hasn't stopped spinning. And in a small way overall, but it's a big way obviously the people involved. The world has got slightly better. So, hanging on to that in politics is a good thing. Mike, let's turn our attention to some classic exit interview questions now. Summing up your various bosses you've had over the years since you were elected in 2010. Sum up David Cameron in a word for us.
Smooth.
Oh, that could be taken two ways, Mike.
Polished then. How about polished?
Polish is slightly better. Yeah.
David is a absolutely amazing politician. I remember the words I remember ringing my ear. Actually, probably it's not a word, but I remember. I think it was Nicholas Soames at the time said, David Cameron is an accomplished politician. He has an amazing ability to get out of a tight corner, but also has amazing ability to get himself into one. And I found David Cameron very easy to deal with. I thought he was an incredibly accomplished politician. And we're seeing that when he's now in the new role of Foreign Secretary. He brings a gravitas to the role. He has an intellect, and he's also very, he's good with people. He can disagree with you forcefully without you feeling you've been beaten up. And I think that's a real skill.
That's David Cameron then. Theresa May in a word.
Honest. I loved working with Theresa, because I dealt with her when she was Home Secretary, was probably the most effective cabinet ministers I'd ever dealt with. So as a backbencher or, you'd go across to see her to press an issue on a constituency issue. You'd go in, she was briefed, she knew what she was talking about. You have your asks and she'd say yes or no. You knew exactly where you stood. And also, if there was an agreed follow-up, by the time you got back to your office in the Commons, her office had been on the phone setting up the follow-ups. Now, that was rare. Normally, when you meet a cabinet minister who promises to do something, you normally have to nag them for months on end. She was just kind of a machine. And I just found her incredibly efficient and also incredibly straightforward.
Very good. Boris Johnson, then, in a word.
Fun.
Bit like smooth. That can be taken two ways, Mike.
Well, I knew Boris from City Hall days, so I was never surprised at Boris's idiosyncrasies. Why anybody should have been surprised that Boris was slightly chaotic, slightly going off on a tangent at times. That was Boris's intellect. I mean, he's great fun to work with because he's intellectually challenged and he made politics fun. But people always said that Boris didn't do detail. That was wrong because I saw firsthand he soaked up detail. I have to be quite careful because sometimes you weren't always quite sure the right detail came out at the right time. But he was phenomenally good to work with. And I always kind of joke that I've touched him up on at least two occasions. So slight humorous anecdote is that, as you know, Boris was not always the smartest of individuals. And so when I was the Foreign Office whip, he was saying he was going off to have lunch with some visiting world leader. And I said, well, for heaven's sake, put your tie up, tuck your shirt in. So I had to kind of smarten him up a bit. And then I remember when he was Prime Minister, and this is when I was controller, I was lurking behind the Speaker's chair because the job was to get the Prime Minister in good time for PMQs. And of course, he comes racing down the corridor as always Boris can. Again, hair all over the place, tie over here, collar up. So next minute, I'm kind of doing his tie up and putting his collar down. And then off he goes into the front bench. Then realised, oh, I've just touched up the PM. So, and the great thing about Boris is actually he's completely nonplussed about it. And the thing I loved about Boris is that you could really have a real policy disagreement with him, and he wouldn't take it personally. he'd take it on the chin, and you wouldn't fall out about it.
And he thought that was just part of politics.
Yeah.
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 So then Boris Johnson then replaced by Liz Truss, who you backed to be Tory leader. So Liz Truss, in a word.
That was quite straightforward because I'd worked when I was Equalities Minister. Liz was the cabinet minister for inequalities, and I found her very easy to deal with. So again, another person that I could go into, have a real ding dong on policy about what we needed to do, on whether we had nuances of differences of opinion, and you could have that kind of robust, real cut and thrust with Liz, and then she'd give you a decision. Because there's nothing worse than actually being left in limbo. And the thing about dealing with Liz on the equalities, she was very straightforward, very direct. And I also was incredibly grateful that when Boris and I kind of fell out over conversion therapy, when he wanted to kind of dump the bill, Liz was remarkably strong at stepping back in and saying we needed to keep the bill. And for that, I thought that was refreshing. It would have been quite easy as someone clear with aspirations to have taken the easy way out and just kind of rode in behind the Prime Minister. But she put her neck above the parapet and said he was wrong and went into bat. And for that, I thought that was something that I was grateful for.
Was she the right person to be Prime Minister?
Well, I think history will tell that story.
Will you read her book?
Once I've left Parliament, I'll have plenty more time to read lots of books. It'll be on the list. I'm not a great one for reading political biographies, I have to say. My reading list tends to be forensic murder mysteries.
Wow.
I like chewing gum. I like chewing gum for the mind. Because in this job, you spend your life reading kind of dry documents.
Yeah.
So when I'm on holiday, the last thing I want to do is read about my colleagues. And so I want to read about how you can murder people efficiently.
Oh. I have to say, I'm similar. Mine is sort of biographies of old comedians, but similarly, just something which is, for you it's murders, for me it's the two Ronnies, but it's a similar thing. Sum up Rishi Sunak in a word.
Again, easy to deal with, does detail, very analytical, and so I'm a bit of a stato, so I kind of warm to that kind of approach. The dealings I've had with him, I found him very refreshing and easy to deal with. So a couple of times, certainly when he was running for leader the first time round, I was able to have a face-to-face conversation and give him some critiques of where, as exports minister, I felt the Treasury were holding back British businesses. And to be fair to him, I didn't find him remotely thin-skinned. I thought he took the criticisms on the chin, listened, and I found that when I've had discussions on other issues, I've been able to go in and see him. In many ways, he's similar to Theresa and Mrs. Thatcher, does detail. And so if you're going to go into bats against the Prime Minister, against Rishi, you really need to know your stuff. And he would respect if you've done your homework. So from that point of view, he's very easy to deal with. But he does like to do the detail. So you need to know your stuff before you go and try and persuade him to do something different.
Very good. That's your bosses then. So some classic exit interview questions. Would you recommend this job to a friend or family member or somebody you cared about?
I've said recently no, and that's possibly because it was all quite raw. I would say they have to think very, very long about it and discuss and really make sure their families understand what's involved. It can be the most rewarding job. It's not just, can you come into Parliament and change the law? You talk about equal marriage. I look at some of the other things I was involved in where you've actually managed to change the law. That's a great part of the job. But also the bits that are rewarding are actually, getting, people's lives improved, cutting through the red tape, sorting out the crap they're having to deal with locally. That's incredibly rewarding. And then you have to balance that up with, it is 24/7 these days. If you let it, and you do have to be quite strict about carving out some personal time. And whether you get serious levels of threats or whether you get the lower level of abuse, people do have to bear that in mind and make sure that they know what they're signing up for. And also, in my view, I think I think rare now that you'll see MPs. I know there's a lot of chatter about why there's such a big turnover. I think it would be quite rare now that you get MPs who serve for 25, 30 years. I think the role has changed dramatically. And I think the pressures of the 24/7, the social media, the emails has changed the role beyond recognition of what it was, 20 years ago. So I think you'll see much more 10-year, 15-year MPs. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because fresh blood is good. But I think, yes, it's a job worth doing, but you need to go into it with your eyes open.
Are you sad about the circumstances in which you're leaving?
Of course. I love my constituents. Even though, like every MP, we've got constituents who drive us to distraction. And we've all got our frequent flyers in the inbox. And that's part of the job. But equally, we see many people where we genuinely make a difference. And actually, what's been quite heartwarming is actually the level of warmth. You're never more popular sometimes than when you step down. That's just quite bizarre. You're going around, you've been stopped in the supermarket. Normally, people respect your privacy, but people stop you and said, "I'm really sorry, but you're stepping down. You've been a great MP," and you don't get to see that because often, we don't see. You've got 78,000 constituents. We probably see face to face a tiny, tiny fraction. So that kind of level of warmth that I've been getting has been, it's made me quite sad. But maybe, as they say in showbiz, you leave and leave them wanting more.
Whenever I've spoken to MPs who've lost their seats, they always say, "Well, if all the people who are telling me they're sad about it now had voted for them, it would have made it would have all been fine."
Exactly.
Final question then, Mike. What will you do next?
Well, I've got a mortgage to pay, so I still have to go and earn some money. So I think it's still early to. I don't want to rush into anything. It's certainly the first few weeks you think, "Oh my God, what have I done? How am I going to pay the mortgage?" And the danger is you grasp the first thing that gets offered. So I don't know yet. I mean, obviously, I've got some strong interests that I'd like to pursue. And so I've still got a few irons in the fire. But to be honest, at this moment, I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen. That's the scary bit.
It's a world of possibilities. Mike, I really appreciate your time today and for seeing us with our exit interview. That was Mike Freer, Conservative MP for Finchley and Golders Green since 2010. Justice Minister standing down at the next election. Mike, thanks for joining us for your exit interview.
Thank you.